Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today, friends, I am taking not only you, but Paul Hoppy, one of my most regular co-hosts, into a garden of contemplation. Paul doesn't actually know what the topic of today's podcast is, and that's kind of intentional. We've had a little bit of a journey getting here. I had a podcast lined up, but my podcast host wasn't able to take part last night because apparently they live in the darkest of Alaska, and the internet is not always great there. So I was trying to figure out what I should do instead. And I wound up going on quite a journey over the last couple weeks, but especially over the last 6 hours or so, as I was driving to Wisconsin to see my partner Abby. On a further journey, I'm going to Cincinnati for a magic event, actually a Lorcana event. And during that time, I went on a journey that really was bringing up all kinds of thoughts that are relevant to this podcast, because it was really a journey into how do we as people, and Paul doesn't think they're part of that group, but how do we, the human species, and Paul, the Paul species, deal with darkness, deal with despair, deal with tragedy, deal with the realization that we're in a terrible situation and we don't think we can change it. And this is a topic I think it's very dear to me, particularly at Christmas time and at holiday time, because so much of this time is about the return of light and the rebirth of light and of heat and of hope and of warmth and abundance into a time that is, for us in the Northern Hemisphere, where a lot of these holidays were created, seen as, for I think understandable reasons, a time of scarcity and darkness and a loss of hope. And so I think there's a lot of relevant topics here, but I really can't dance around it anymore. Those of you who are fans of a certain podcast may know what I mean when I say that I'm in the garden of contemplation, that we're going to be talking about the Shadow Man. But for those who don't understand, this all starts with my viewing of a movie called Paul Blart Mall Cop 2. Again, Paul has no idea what's happening here, and so he's laughing a bit about this.
I didn't even know this was an episode of Superhero Ethics. I thought you were, starting a new podcast, and you're like, yeah, do you want to just be on this podcast? And I'm not going to tell you, what it is. Just like the very first episode of Superhero Ethics, where you were like, hey, do you want to talk about Batman? And press record. I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And then here we are, however many episodes later.
Hundreds of episodes later. I forgot that, that's what we did with that first episode, but I was in a bad place, so you were helping out.
It's all good.
You and Kevin Smith.
It's been a journey.
But, so anyway, and let me start by being clear, this is a horrendously bad movie. I'm not in any way encouraging anyone to watch this movie. I don't think anyone should watch this movie. I think the movie is actively harmful to American society, and isn't in the top 10 or even the top 20 reasons why Trump got elected, but is probably somewhere on the list. But the only reason why I care about this movie is that it was shown to me over the holiday break. A good friend of Mary's and myself, Ash, was staying with us for a couple weeks after some surgery they were going through. And she was like, we were talking about holiday movies. She was like, we have to see this Thanksgiving movie. And I had vaguely heard about Paul Blart, Mall Cop. I didn't realize there was a second one. And I knew that, Adam Sandler, Kevin James kind of humor is generally not for me. I had not paid any attention to it, and I didn't understand why she was claiming it was a Thanksgiving movie. But as she went on to explain, it's not itself a Thanksgiving movie. It's that the McElroy brothers, who many people know from the podcast My Brother and Me, or their D&D podcast, or they become kind of podcasting people of great renown, and my spouse is a big fan of them. Apparently, they had teamed up with people from another podcast called The Worst Idea of All Time, where they take a particularly bad movie and watch it every week for 52 weeks and record on it each week. Had decided to take that concept and expand it, and that a Thanksgiving tradition for both of their communities would be that every year they would come together to watch Paul Blart Mall Cop 2 and discuss it, and use it as a way to mark the passage of time. And they made a very big deal about how this was going to be a forever thing, and they even were picking, when they passed away, who would be their successors, and all this kind of thing. Now, let me stress again, this is a very bad movie. It is a movie where, as far as I can tell, the writing was actively competing to see Could it be more fat-phobic? Could it be more misogynistic? Or could it be more just generally insulting to the working class and security guards in specific? The movie itself would not be worth talking about, and frankly, they talk about it at great length and do it with great hilarity. But I listened to 1 or 2 episodes over the last week or so, and then on this aforementioned 5-hour drive, I listened to probably 4 full episodes of theirs. And it wound up being this startling, insight into how we deal with horror, how we deal with despair. Because every year, they would come together and they would talk about, the horrible experience of watching this movie and the sense of impending dread. But something interesting started happening over those various years, which is that they all started to deal with this horrible situation. And granted, I'm speaking in, you're watching a bad movie for 2 hours. This is nothing compared to the actual tragedies of the world. And I think they're always being fairly tongue-in-cheek about their pain about it, but the pain is quite real. And you could start to see the different ways that they would react to it. Because for some of them, the first year, they're all just okay, this is really bad, and we're just going to have fun talking about how bad it is. But that wears off after a year or two. You can't keep doing the same jokes again and again and again. And so they started to diverge. And for some of them, they started, it felt like it was I am faced with this terrible thing in my life. The best I can do is to find a way to be okay with it, to find the good parts in it, to find the things that can bring me joy, and that maybe it's not so bad, and that's kind of a coping mechanism. And for others, they would get very angry at that and be like, no, we have to rage. We cannot accept that there's anything acceptable about this situation. We have to live in our grief and in our upsetness about this. And just those 2 positions alone speak to me quite a lot about, I think, a lot of the things we talk about on this podcast, about what do you do in the midst of terrible situations, and do you fight back? Do you try to think about how it could be better, or do you just accept and find the beauty in the darkness and all that kind of thing? And then as more years went on, more and more some of them started looking for deeper meaning. And so they started taking scenes such as when Kevin James playing Paul Blart, I think some would argue the antagonist of the movie. Some would say the protagonist. Many would say just a horrible person, although the director seems to want us to have them redeemed by the end. But halfway through the movie, they fight a large bird for no real reason, and the bird kicks their ass, I think to the cheers and joys of most. And during that scene, there's just a guy playing a piano throughout the whole thing. Utterly, not responding in any way to Kevin James's pleas for help, to Paul Bart's pleas for help, but clearly acknowledging Paul Blart. And even to the end, when Paul Blart has walked away from the fight, beaten but not bloodied but not broken, but there's no real damage to the bird, to be very, very clear. The bird is the victor in this fight. But as he walks away, he looks at that man playing the piano and kind of just nods, is like, thanks for the help. And the guy just smiles at him and nods his head in acknowledgement and keeps playing the piano. And so that scene has now taken on mythic proportions within their watch of it. They're discussing is it supposed to be that the bird is God and the piano player is Satan, or and challenging him, or that the piano player is actually urging him on to face his inner demons represented by the bird. They're finding such deep meaning in this where clearly none was meant to exist to begin with. And so I was hoping Paul would have had more funny interjections along this whole path, and maybe this whole podcast idea was a ridiculous one. But we're here. We're going to go through it. We're going to find a way to have a conversation.
Well, I was thinking you should flip the bird there, the metaphor, because when you describe that scene to me, that sounds to me more like the bird. Wait, yeah, the bird sounds more like a Satan figure, and the dude playing on the piano seems to me like what I would imagine if I could conceive of the idea that there was some omnipotent power in this world, which I don't, I think it would be about as interested in what humans are doing as that piano player, just based on the reality that I see in front of me. And I think that's fair. And the bird seems like, it's just there trying to, live its life. But I don't know. You know what? Yeah, it just sounded backwards to me. And then I thought, flip the bird. I'm like, hey, that sounds appropriate too, because that's what people want to do to this movie, I think.
Flip the bird. It's fitting. And that So that actually, we'll get back to the question of suffering and the like, but that's actually a perfect example of the other thing that this movie really struck me as is I kind of feel like I'm watching the birth of mythology.
Right,
that,
yeah.
Yeah, because like I'm telling you this ridiculous story and how people are finding ridiculous meaning, and now you're continuing this idea of like, just based on you haven't seen the movie. You're just hearing my retelling of other people considering it, and you're coming up with your own stories and meaning around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, not meaning that I am emotionally attaching myself to, but meaning that if you're gonna go down that path, you know, this sounds more logical to me. I will note that we did watch the Star Wars Holiday Special together with a group of people, and did not make that an annual tradition.
We did not. Many have. I chose that I love my fans and I love myself.
Yeah, that particular kind of sadism or masochism is not. No thanks.
Yeah.
Although the good in that, I got to see B. Arthur sing to a bunch of aliens, and that scene is magnificent in its own. Really, it feels kind of like this old bird thing in a way.
And we got Boba Fett and the Mandalorians.
That's true.
Like, I would say that, like, the Star Wars Christmas special, to me, it sits in a larger tableau. So we can understand it, even if it is a particularly, like, you know, it's a bad stitch in that tableau. And it felt like I was able to laugh along with the pain the first time. I think maybe if I watch it again and again, I would probably have similar feelings. But to me, that feels different because it does feel like it is part of, again, this larger Star Wars story. Whereas this is just...
Well, this is part 2. Who knows what part 3 may bring?
But
does that bird get a spin-off?
I have not yet seen the bird have a spin-off. Okay. There have been there was some hope, apparently, that during the pandemic, when people were digging deeper and deeper into the bottom of the barrel to find content, that somehow Paul Blart 3 might have risen to the top, but such has yet to happen.
Sadness. For those people. I literally don't care. Although I will say, like, I'm always mildly offended at just how bad Pauls are in movies. You know?
I had not even considered that this was about a fellow Paul. Yeah. Because you're so not this person.
No.
I mean, Paul Atreides is kind of cool.
I guess, yeah. I mean,
he's
maybe
kind of a messianic figure who saves the whole galaxy. Spoilers for books that are almost 100 years old.
I thought that didn't work out super well. Spoilers for something that I actually didn't read, but I've had the length of the Dune mythology explained to me by Ashley Coffin, and I might not have the whole thing down straight, but it sounds very interesting. I think it doesn't
work out for him in the end, but like, he does save the universe or the galaxy or some all
right, okay,
portion of
one point for cinematic Pauls.
Well, who are some other anti-Pauls then? We have Paul Blart.
Yeah, well, there's Paul Spiricki in Grosse Pointe Blank, who's the Jeremy Piven character, who's the kind of sort of slimy real estate. I don't have a whole bunch that pop to mind, but that's kind of the point. The point is that they're often kind of bland. Like, they're like the boyfriend of the love interest who needs to be, you know, like...
Yeah.
It's like, or just kind of like nothing characters a lot of the time. I don't think this was always true. I think this was less true like many decades ago. You know, when Paul Newman was a big star.
In our very Christianized society, which is not a good thing, but is just the way it is.
That's what it is.
The name does go back to the guy who's the original, like, I'm not the protagonist of the story, but I'm going to try to be.
Right,
in terms of the Apostle Paul, who's like, I used to be a schmuck, but now I'm trying to be better, and I want everyone to listen about this other guy, but also listen to me a lot. And so I can kind of see some things. Yeah, I'm trying to think, though, of other good Pauls. Like, I feel like there have been some good Pauls on TV. I mostly think of Paul Reiser characters, and probably his characters are named not Paul, but I just think of Paul Reiser as such a great actor.
Sure. I think of him as actually not as kind of dislikable in that same way, though, where he just feels a little... Maybe that's just from, like, Aliens... But
that's fair.
I feel like he's off. Also, I just saw him in Beverly Hills Cop, which I rewatched recently.
How did that age?
Okay. I mean, there's certainly parts that were funny are still funny. You know, there's some jokes that probably don't quite, work the same way. But it's interesting. You know.
Yeah. Because I recently watched Die Hard as, again, sort of a Christmas movie.
Yeah.
It's still a wonderful movie of its time, but it has not aged well. Particularly having a central plot, forgive me spoilers for a 40-year-old movie, but about will the cop who shot a teenager be willing to find his copness again so he can use his gun again as a great heroic moment. Like, that doesn't really... It probably wasn't as great as I thought it was in the time. I mean, it was 6, but also, like, just not great today in any way. But back to these topics, just on the mythology thing further, like, what do you think of when someone says the word mythology or like this is a myth? Like, what does that mean to you in terms of how you feel about the stories you care about?
Yeah, I mean, I think of mythology as basically stories that like have a tendency or goal of like really grabbing the imagination in a like fundamental, like visceral way, that are made up, but that people are very deeply attached to, Right. And, I mean, I think it's interesting that there are so many similarities from mythologies to other mythologies, including in parts of the world that like had no contact with one another, presumably. There's
Right.
things that show up frequently, and I find that very interesting. I don't necessarily find a lot of meaning in that, or try to make like assumptions about like what happened to cause that, or so much as like maybe there are kind of certain psychological needs that people have, that are like, if not universal, very common, and then in addition to that, though, I think drawing parallels between different stories or different mythologies, it's easy to go too far and see everything as just like an archetype and ignore the specifics, which, could be cultural specifics or could be storytelling specifics, and kind of be like, like I think that Joseph Campbell, Hero with a Thousand Faces, like speaks to certain truth, but then is reductive as well, right? And so I think a lot of the times that's what's going to happen. But I mean, like from a personal enjoyment standpoint, I find big mythological stories fun. I think is kind of how I've always kind of viewed them all, as a sort of entertainment. And to me, sort of the fewer people who care deeply about a story, like beyond just kind of like what happens and the characters and whatever, kind of the easier I find it to enjoy.
Right.
And I think the more that, kind of modern mythology or modern stories really overtly try to echo religious mythology that is currently followed or appreciated in whatever capacity, I think for me that tends to be a turnoff, because it feels a little too much like someone's trying to. I never really enjoy feeling like the storytellers are trying to make a really explicit point or a really specific point. I enjoy stories more that tend to kind of raise questions and encourage the viewer or the listener or the reader to just have some thoughts, just like, which it sounds like Paul Blart, Mall Cop 2, kind of, if you really dig in there, sounds like it can do that, but then maybe any story can. I don't know.
Well, I think what you just said is kind of the whole thesis statement that I've been wrestling with, is because to me the fact that, and kind of the little exchange we had at the beginning, I think is kind of a proof of it, how there's a bunch of what you said that I want to respond to, but I want to kind of pull on this thread and go back to something you said at the very beginning, which is that, mythologies are, that if I understood you correctly, you were saying like mythologies are made up. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Certainly that I think part of what marks a myth is that we don't in any way have knowledge or proof that it did literally happen. And most of the time we have proof that it literally didn't happen. But then a lot of the time, my understanding at least, is that there is some kernel of truth that then like gets told and retold, and it becomes mythologized and becomes mythology that sometimes has basis in literal truth and sometimes is just stories that people made up.
Right.
But to me, that's part of what the Paul Blart process has been fascinating to me about. The podcast is called Till Death Do Us Blart.
It hurts.
Yeah,
It hurts.
Yeah, it does. It does. So Death Blart is maybe the best way to describe this whole thing.
Darth Blart.
But yeah, it really got me thinking about, like, can any story just become a myth like that? And can we look for meaning like that in almost any story? Because you're right. Like, I think a lot of the things that often to me strike me about myths is that they're somewhat primordial. Like they touch upon kind of like fundamental questions or fundamental issues. And so, for example, that scene in the Garden of Contemplation, man versus nature is a story that I think is often mythologized. And you as a vegan have helped me to see that like I think one of the things that's happened in the last however many decades is we're re-examining a lot of our myths. And when I say we, I should say those in the overculture, white, straight, cis, all the American, British, whatever, have been looking a lot more at the myths that we have always seen ourselves in as the heroes, and realizing that, wait, a lot of people in the see themselves as the oppressed in the myth and not see the myth as heroic. And I think the man versus nature one is that you and talking to you about veganism have really helped me to see in a different way. But still, I think that this kind of is it's the primordial story of man versus nature, and also then of, do you treat the suffering of another human with empathy or with disdain or with like the kind of like, because I think like to me I'm playing music for you, buddy, is like, thoughts and prayers, So yeah, that I think is just a fascinating way of kind of looking at it all.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that like in sporting events, like that's what cheering is, right? And it is actually, you hear athletes talk all the time about, wanting to thank the fans and how much it means to them to have their support and blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, I don't know. I think sometimes having someone, I mean, the thing about sporting events is the fans can't really do much else unless they're like Jeffrey Mayer or something, and they want to,
right.
either rob a home run or make a home run, something that wouldn't have been.
He just wanted to catch a foul ball.
Just wanted to. That one was a home run though. That wasn't a foul ball, right? The other guy in Chicago, that was a foul ball. This was you just want to catch a ball, but like. In general, fans can't really intercede on behalf of, the people they're rooting for. Whereas here, maybe there's an idea, well, this guy could have done something. But I don't know. Maybe he would have helped the bird. I might have helped the bird.
I mean, he might have been bound by the rules. Like, on the Star Wars podcast, we recently discussed, like, why is it that Obi-Wan says, Luke, if you go to face Vader at the end of Empire, I cannot interfere. Like,
right.
Is it because there's some Jedi rule? Is it that, like, his force projection powers won't work there? Like, we don't know. And so maybe to Luke's perspective, Obi-Wan is just the guy playing piano while he fights the Vader bird or whatever it is.
Yeah, he kind of is. He's like, if you strike me down, I will become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. Like, really, Obi-Wan? Really? Like, is that... You're like, hey, go talk to Yoda. He'll help you. Yeah. Like, that's like, he doesn't... I think more powerful than you can possibly imagine would be. I can imagine that powerful. That's
I do think, like, in some ways, I think of one of the things that to me is very much a big part of mythology, and this is why I think that the Blartification of it all is so relevant, is that yes, there are these myths of things like King Arthur and Robin Hood and 1001 Nights and stuff like that we can find whether there's historicity to it or not, but the stories have taken on a power of their own. But there's also myths in our own lives and in our own, and like I think Babe Ruth's Called Shot is a great example to me of like I'd heard that story told to me 100 times.
Yeah.
And then you dig deeper and there's a lot of people who were there who were like, he was kind of just like pointing at a bird or something, or like, he like there's all these different versions of like, is that what really happened?
Right.
And even to the point of like, you and I have been friends for blah, blah number of years. It's a very high number.
Yes, that's accurate.
Think about.
That's accurate.
And there are stories among us that have become mythologized, you know, like the right number of chips for the right number of salsa.
Yeah,
and
well,
like
you gotta
that's
protect
a story
the ratio.
Yeah, you probably remember the exact details of which better than I, but it's got like there are people in my life who know that story because they've heard me make reference to other situations, but whereas the metaphor I just use the like there's not enough chips for this salsa.
Right.
They have no idea what happened. They've just heard my retelling of it. It's become a myth, but it's a myth that holds meaning. For those who don't know, we had a certain amount of salsa, a certain amount of chips among me, Paul, and our friend Adam. Our friend Adam was eating chips without the salsa,
Unacceptable.
which was very concerning to Paul because it was upsetting the ratio therein. And
They're just going to have a bunch of salsa without any chips to eat it. I mean, what's that? You want me to drink salsa?
I think that's a reason to go get more chips, but, you know, that continues the life cycle forever.
We were, like, in the middle of nowhere at someone's country house on, like, some island somewhere. There were not going to be more chips for a good 3 days. Like, these were the amount of chips we had. We had a certain amount of salsa, and they needed to go together. But it's okay.
And to be clear, we were, I think, like 16 or 17. We were not, like, going to go hop in a car and go get more chips at the store 10 miles away or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we were, like, 18 or 19 or almost 20-ish, maybe less than 20. But also, I don't think maybe you had a driver's license. I know I didn't.
You're right. You're older than I remember. But again, so the details get forgotten. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So we'll come back to the myth point, but I want to go back to what is for me, I think, kind of the fundamental thing, which is that this question of how do people respond to horrible situations? And again, having to watch a bad movie once for 2 hours out of a year is not the worst situation. It's kind of a microcosm, but it was still very interesting to me. What have you observed that you either find like this is helpful to me, or this is troubling to me, or this I find tempting but I don't want to do, in terms of like how you respond or how you see other people respond to really bad situations, but that people feel like they can't do anything about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from a fairly young age, I realized that the world was filled with things that I thought were like unimaginably awful, and that I had very little ability to do anything about any of those directly. And, you know, my first reaction, I think, is generally like, well, what can I do about any of this? And if the answer is, well, here's something you can do to actually meaningfully make things better, then I usually try to do that, you know? But I think what we're talking about more is things where that's not, you know, I'm not going to go end a war somewhere, you know?
Yeah.
I'm not going to stop people from oppressing one another or animals, like, globally in like an afternoon, you know? That's not a thing. Or even in a lifetime, right? It's not a thing one person can do. But, you know, there are things that we can do to try to either reduce some of those things, like these huge, horrible things that go on throughout the world, or at least do our best to not contribute to furthering them, right? I mean, to me, that's the first step, is to try and understand, okay, here's all this horrible stuff, all this harm that's being done, and, you know, oftentimes it's like, oh, I see how I'm not intentionally a part of it, but am a part of it, you know? And then it's like, how, to what extent can I reduce that, you know? And then beyond that, when there is still so much suffering and horror in the world, I think finding a way to do something else that's not engaging with that constantly, you know? I play bullet chess. Like, you know, I mean, people have the things, but like having something else to spend some mental energy on, right? I mean, even if you say, you know what, I've decided that this situation is unacceptable and I know I can't completely change it, but I've decided to dedicate my entire life to trying to change this one thing, or make whatever impact I can.
Yeah.
If that's your goal is to just have the maximum effect on a thing, I don't believe that spending all of your time trying to do that is the most efficient way. I don't think that's the way you're going to have the biggest effect. I think
burnout is very real.
It is.
And like, if you spend 10 years doing nothing but that thing and then just are done.
Yeah.
Like, or you spend like 50 years spending 70% of your time doing that thing, or even 40% or 10% of your time. That's probably a far more effective way of, making the change.
Yeah. Yeah. Except for the 10%, because then that would be only about half as much, unless effort over time is the math. But the point being
returns and all that.
Yeah. The point matters though. The point is like but it's probably even 10%, because if you're trying to put 100% of your energy at the end of in 5 years in, you're not going to have as much energy, right? It's like if it's like, well, why are you sleeping? Really? You think you have the luxury to sleep while people are dying? Like, yeah, you do, because you can't do anything productive if you never sleep, right? So it's like, obviously you have to have some kind of rest, something. You have to eat. You have to mentally replenish yourself. You have to take care of yourself enough to be able to take care of anybody else, to be able to help anybody else in any way, really.
Right.
But then if what you really do want to do is do as much as you can for something, then you have to understand, like, at what point you're kind of just making an excuse to like rest too much or whatever. And, but, I wouldn't say that there's anything that I've decided, like, I'm going to put all of myself into that. Right. I mean, I wouldn't be doing most of the things I do if that's the case. I mostly have tried to kind of, withdraw from a lot of things. And basically when something seems really messed up to me, I just generally tend to say that's really messed up and try and help other people or encourage other people to come to the same conclusion, to the best of my ability. But yeah, I mean, I think finding a way to not be constantly confronted with whatever horror it is, and even like, I mean, I took someone to the dentist today, and this is very Paul Blart. This is not, it's on the, I think going to the dentist is probably more painful than watching any movie, but maybe not. I mean, physically anyway, right? Maybe not emotionally. I'm thinking about the things that I've hated the most, and I'm like, I'd rather go to the dentist than like watch the end of Dexter again, or like, certain scenes from other things or whatever, so, but like, this is just like it's just literal pain and discomfort, right? And when I go to the dentist, like, often I'll do all of my Taekwondo patterns in my head, even if I'm not really practicing regularly. Or like now, like maybe I would try and do some like blindfold chess problems in my head. Or like sometimes if my brain just isn't like really going there, like I'll actually take my fingernails and like dig them into the back of the other hand. As just like a distraction. It's like, oh, well, this little discomfort is actually distracting me from this other larger discomfort. And so like if something just seems like overwhelming, like if you want to be trying to help people with things and you're like, well, that thing's too much. It's just too much for me right now.
Right.
It's like, you can try and find some smaller thing where people also need help, but it just doesn't feel like too much to you right now. And you can still be, constructive.
There's
and helpful.
In Judaism, there's a concept called tikkun olam, which is loosely, I'm going to get this bad. I'm been exposed to Judaism all my life, but I'm not a Jewish theologian by any means. But it's basically the idea of that to save a single life is to save the world entire, and that like it's about doing the little bit you can. And it's a very interesting question, because part of what it got me thinking as well is that in so many of the superhero type stories that I care most about, the biggest thing that the hero can do is to inspire others, is to give people the thought that there is something that they can do, that they don't have to just accept this crushing reality because there are alternatives. I often go to V for Vendetta as my favorite example, but I do think that it's a big part of that, but also of many other stories of, I think Andor, the TV show, is a perfect example of this, as is Rogue One, of where one person specifically in Star Wars, they say fear is what will keep people in line. Mm-hmm. Because when it's a minority oppressing a majority, they always know, like, if every single person in the majority rises up, the minority is going to lose. But a significant part of the majority are going to die.
Yeah.
And that fear I think for very legitimate reasons,
Sure.
keeps people from doing it.
Yeah.
But that the way horrible things can play into it is it just gets to be so bad that it's not even like an actualized fear of this person has a gun or this person's going to fire me. It's just a kind of a generalized fear, you know? And so this is why, and I'm skipping around a couple topics here, but I think it all ties together, you know, friends of mine who were like the first woman pastor at a church, like it was often the older women who had the most trouble accepting them. And in getting to know them, this wasn't always the truth, but often it was because those were women who might have wanted to be pastors like 30, 40 years ago and were told they couldn't be.
Right.
But that once one person was able to do it and show like, wait, it actually, you can do this. Other people can say, hey, wait, I can do this too. And I always thought that that's V for Vendetta, like, you know, by blowing up the Old Bailey at the beginning of the movie and then continuing to challenge the government in ways that they see, like, you know, the other people see, like, the government isn't as scary and completely totalitarianly oppressive as we seem to think it is. Not that it's better than we think it is, but just that it can be challenged.
Yeah,
you know?
it's just
And I
not
think
all powerful.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, and granted, like, it's not quite the same in the Death Blart because they voluntarily agreed to do this,
Right?
And it's kind of a keeping watch thing. But I was thinking about all this, especially because with some of them would start to, you know, it's not so bad. You know, like, these are some good parts to it. And then, like, when they were really pushed by the others on the podcast, they're like, okay, yeah, no, it's an awful movie. Don't get me wrong. But I had a good watch this year. I enjoyed some parts of it, you know? And because I think, to me, one of the things, and granted, I've only watched the movie once. I can't say that if I'd watched it every year for 7 years, where I would be with it. But I know that for me, in some of the harder situations we deal with, and I think COVID is the best example of this, but a lot of others, capitalism, I think, is another great one. Like, it is easy to start basically kind of like being so used to the hardest parts, the worst parts, that we kind of stop thinking about them. We just kind of take for granted, okay, well, capitalism sucks, but hey, it gave us 20 different kinds of cereal, so maybe that's kind of cool. Or, you know, COVID is bad. You know, just the, like, how quickly people acclimated themselves to, we don't need masks anymore, we don't need to be protected anymore. Jump in at some point, because I think there's all a point here, but, you know, I'm not maybe articulating it well.
Yeah, I mean, I love cereal. I don't like COVID. Haven't had it to my knowledge, which I think I often get the reaction like that, you know, there's that's not a large number of people who you know, that's true. But yeah, it is, you know, it's people. I mean, I had a conversation with another friend who was saying, you know, I don't even know how many times I've had it now, but like, it's a lot. He's like, well, I guess I'm just gonna get sick every so often if I, you know, he's a poker player, you know, and live poker player. So he's always around, you know, I mean, right when COVID was kind of still up and coming, it was, I was like, I think a poker table is just about one of the worst places for, like, is one of the most efficient ways of spreading something like this, right? So
because everyone's facing, it's not even like people breathing into the back of your head. You're all facing each other.
Exactly.
A lot of you are making like loud exclamations.
Yeah.
The air is very stale in those places, you know, like.
I mean, I do think like a comedy is probably worse than like a drama in terms of a movie theater. But like, you're right that like in a movie theater, everybody's all facing the same way. Right?
Yeah.
So, like, people are going to breathe on the back of your head. You go home, take a shower, whatever. You know, I'm not saying people don't get COVID in movie theaters, but, like, a poker table, you have a group of people sitting around just breathing right at each other, which also, without COVID, isn't always the most pleasant experience on its own. But the point being that, like, there is, like, you know, I mean, there's certain bad things that you do say, well, okay, in order to try and avoid this, what am I giving up? What's the, you know, you make your own calculations, right? But there is once you make those, you have to accept kind of the consequences. Like, I've accepted the consequences of like, I'm just not going to see people as often because this is something that I actually care about being cautious about. Other people who don't want to be as cautious have to accept that you're going to get sick more often, you know? And that's just, that's a spot where at least like you have some agency, you know, to some extent. Like, that's one thing. Whereas like, let's say you lived somewhere that was getting bombed and just random people were just getting killed on a regular basis. You don't have agency there. You still have to accept that on any given day, you might just randomly get murdered. And that to me, that sounds harder to deal with, even if the sort of percentages and the death count was the same, it feels like, and I mean, overall reality is a little bit like that, because on any given day, you could just have a fatal stroke or whatever. Like this is life, right? At any point, we could just no longer exist. But there are circumstances under which those are unreasonably high chances. And so,
I think the idea of the agency really matters because, this happened early in the bombings of Gaza, but it's something that's really struck with me. There was some church was attacked or somewhere else where there was like stained glass windows, and a Gazan resident took a picture of the way the light was hitting the stained glass and the rubble on the ground at sunset. It was absolutely gorgeous. And there was a lot of debate about is this okay and to be sharing and talking about. And somewhere in the thread comment, someone asked what if an Israeli took this picture? And I feel like those would be, to me, two fundamentally different. Well, if an Israeli soldier or someone who was actively supporting that, Again, governments aren't their people.
Yeah.
But to me, if you're the one getting bombed and you're able to find some beauty in the midst of this horrible tragedy, God bless you. And if you can share that and help make it more bearable, that's fantastic. If then other people are like, no, look, it's not so bad. Look at the beauty they found. Of course not. But those who are in the midst of suffering, finding beauty, I think, is understandable. It's, I think, the idea of people looking at the suffering of others and finding beauty in it, or looking at the beauty and then using that as a way to be well, no, I don't think an individual person in Gaza could honestly do anything to stop the bombing that's happening other than what they're doing, clearly. Petitioning and letting people know about suffering, and it's on all of us to try and stop that horrible events. But and I don't know if you see this, but I do feel that there are times where I see people kind of finding ways to enjoy terrible situations when they could be doing more to get out of it. And when it's not just a terrible situation for them, but also for others around them. And that's, I think, often where I find kind of I get frustrated somewhat, of the there. And again, because it's very difficult for me to critique someone who's in a situation I am not in. So it's I can only talk about this in terms of situations that I've been in, But I find I often get frustrated watching people using the sort of very human urge to find a way to make the unacceptable acceptable. Use that as a way to never actually question, is this unalterably unacceptable, or could I change this?
Yeah. And I mean, that kind of, is the difference between unnecessary fatalism and a true lack of agency, and that's sort of where I was going with what I said is, I said is my first reaction. I'd like it to be my first reaction. I'm not saying that it's necessarily always that, but, I think the first question to ask is, can I do anything to change this? And so if you are suffering yourself, asking, can I do anything to change this? I think is the best way to proceed. If you are able to do that, right? I mean, there are certain conditions under which you might not even be able to have the time or the thought or whatever to really go there. But providing that you are able, I think that is a best first step. And when the answer is yes, then it's just get on it, And when the answer is no, then that I think is when, it's not a fatalism, it's an acceptance of reality, right? It's a very real question. And there's not always going to be an obvious answer, right? I mean, you don't always know whether you can do something about something. It's well, here's the problem. And then it's going to take some thought to figure out whether you can find any solutions to it. And occasionally maybe it'll be no, there's nothing I can do about this. And then acceptance has to occur, or is useful anyway.
I think that's a really good way to put it, and I feel like, kind of go back to where we were before, it's why, to me, maybe the better way even of phrasing the heroic act is to help people see they have agency that they didn't think they had.
Yeah.
Because I think that's kind of the whole idea. It's a mythology of the mythology that you don't have a choice, you know? And like sometimes in discords, in discussions, not like Discord the program, but just like discourse.
Discourse, yeah.
I'll see people who have a choice to do something today being very critical of those who didn't choose that in the past. Like people who may have been, you know, we would look back on and say, that seems like someone who we would think of as homosexual or transgender today, but they didn't lead that life at the time. And I think it's really easy to be like, oh, that was because they were a coward or they were... It's like, no, like, part of the things people have really fought for is that in a lot of parts of the world, absolutely not enough, but in a lot of parts of the world, people who feel like being straight or being cis or being, you know, a particular gender identity or being, you know, like preppy or any of these things, like, it isn't. They do have agency. They could be something else. But not everyone knows that, and not everyone understands that. And that's certainly true today. It's absolutely true of different situations. And so, yeah, the heroic thing can often be just like, no, you don't have to accept the tyranny of this government. You can stand up to the empire. You can stand up to, what do they call themselves? The Nords party in V for Vendetta or whatever it is. You can vote for, I'm not even going to go, you know, like.
Yeah, you can vote for people who you don't think are going to win, but you think it's a better place for your vote to go to. And you can try to change things politically even when it seems hopeless. And a lot of the times that fails, and sometimes it doesn't, right? I mean, democracy is a thing that is not perfectly executed really anywhere on the planet as far as I know, but there are elections, and they're one aspect of like deciding how things go, right?
Yeah.
And I'm certainly not going to say, oh, just vote and, you know, and that's it. You've done everything you can. But like there are things that people don't think that they can do that they can do, you know, and as you were saying before, like if everybody who doesn't think they have power decides to stand up and use their power together, you know, and on the year end thing, I was talking about unions and how that they can't, you know, their power structures, and they're not always necessarily going to do things that everybody else thinks are the best things to do. But that's the prime example of like people in a collective saying, you know what, individually, we don't have that much power, but when we act together, we do have a lot of power.
Well, I think one of the mythologies that was built in this country and in England and a lot of other places was that unions were fundamentally corrupt.
Right.
And there was an awful lot of truth to that mythology. And it became in many ways a self-fulfilling narrative because a lot of the people who weren't corrupt wanted nothing to do with the unions. And a large part of the more recent union movement is a lot of people challenging that mythology. And we're like, wait, unions don't have to be old boys clubs.
Yeah.
Unions don't have to be for, you know, these particular professions. They can be for things that are, the term that's often used is like a janitor's union 50 years ago we would never think of something like SEIU, which is now one of the strongest unions. Like I think it still existed, but it was, you know, much more thought that it was for like, you know, again, quote unquote, skilled labor.
Yeah.
You know.
And in a way it makes the most sense for, I guess, less skilled labor, or for, that's not the way to say it. I think it makes the most sense for the people with the least power, I think, is what I would say. Which isn't to say it doesn't make sense for people with more power, you know. But I do think there's a difference between, like, people doing physical labor that's somewhat sort of fungible, right? Like, one person's work is going to be very similar in quality to another person's. Not identical, but just it's like, there's a job to be done and you do the job. And I think that's kind of different from, like, writing a Hollywood movie where it's like, you know, art is different from craft and from different types of work. You know, different types of work are different from one another. But that's not to say there shouldn't be a writer's guild. That's just to say, on a previous episode, I said some things about, like, not thinking it was all the best. And I want to make sure it's clear that, like, I'm not saying that I don't think it should exist. And overall, I think unions are very important. But that, it's always, always be concrete is kind of one of my sort of mottos of thinking, which is like, let's look at exactly what's going on here, and
Right.
a lot of unions got slandered for as being corrupt, but then there also is some corruption sometimes. And just like trying to draw large conclusions, I think often leads to very poor thinking and then poor results. Or good results for the people who are deliberately spreading such things.
Right, the misinformation and the mythology.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I think the welfare mom is 100% a mythology that was constructed in this country.
Yeah.
Very intentionally for very specific reasons.
Yes.
And is now being largely dismantled in a lot of areas, but not in all.
Yeah.
One thing I was thinking before when you're talking about mythology and how, like, people will look to see, like, is there, like, a spiritual meaning to the fact that these communities that seem so unconnected come up with similar myths. And this is kind of a divergence, but it's all kind of connected. To me, there are two myths that I think of that are from, like, biblical times that to me speak to two ways they can be created that as a person of faith I find spirituality in, but I don't think are integral. I think you can understand them without any sense of spirituality whatsoever. One of which, as I said, is that, like, most communities that experience a winter and experience a spring have holidays built around that calendar that celebrate those things in some way. There's often a celebration of abundance at the time of the harvest. There's often a sense of hope in the time of the most darkness. There's a time of renewal and rebirth in the time of spring. And people can say, like, oh, it's all stolen from pagans. Like, many of the ways that it's done is true, but, like, a lot of these cultures that have no connection to each other whatsoever still have that kind of celebration of some kind. And I think, so, like, you can find spiritual meaning in that, but you can also just say, like, that makes sociological sense for how we'd react to these cycles of the year. In a totally different way, another thing that, like, truthers of the Bible like to point to is that a number of different Middle Eastern cultures that had, as far as we know archaeologically, no contact with each other, have their own myth of a flood. And that the flood mythology appears in a lot of these different cultures. And so a lot of people point to and say, oh, look, that's proof that, like, Noah's Ark and God's flood is real. Then some archaeologists looked into this a lot more and discovered that there was a time when that part of the world was covered by a glacier. And at the end of the last ice age, that glacier melted and there was intense flooding in a lot of the world. And that flooding it's literally called the Fertile Crescent, and that flooding led to that. But that the flooding caused massive disruption at the time it happened. And so, like, of course, all these people would have, like, a story about a flood because there was flooding. But it wasn't, like, it is easily scientifically explained. Not necessarily, God got angry and thus became incredibly genocidal. Whatever the story is. Yeah. So
I think, and it's funny because I thought that you were going to mention the flood because when I was, like, much like in school, I remember, like, actually doing some sort of just like comparative mythology, just like looking at, like, several different mythologies, not even just in that area, but, like, throughout the world. And this, like, idea of a flood does seem to be, like, recurring in many places. And,
right.
The idea that, like, there was an ice age and the glaciers melted and, like, like, something being inspired by history doesn't mean that it's, like, exactly what happened, right? And so if you look at one mythology or another, and if you draw some, whatever kind of feelings from that, that's cool. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but it definitely, we can see where certain stories can presumably have come from and how, stories change over time, right? I mean, especially before the written word, right? Like, stories,
traditions.
Stories were passed down generation, and, probably combined and split into different versions. And I mean,
certainly we know of that happening. Like, it certainly happened biblically, and that, we have different creation stories that are not only logically contradictory in terms of the number of days, but like, in one, God is this primordial force that moves over the waters, and in another is this being that walks in the garden with Adam and Eve, and like all these differences. And the Hebrew that they're written in is two fundamentally different dialects. And so now a lot of people have come to understand that there were a number of different Hebraic groups that, like, when the Hebrew people were formed, like, people as a way of building a national mythology to pull people together, like, combined all these stories. In the same way, we know that, like, the Saxon and other peoples who lived in pre-Norman invasion Britain had these stories about a King Arthur and a round table and all these kind of, like, epic stories. And that the Norman invaders, the French, brought with them the story of Lancelot and the story of a king and a knight and a queen and this, like, love triangle they had. Today, we think of them all as part of the Arthur story of, Arthur's cycle of stories. And the version we have fits together. But, you go back into the records of the stories, it's pretty fundamentally clear that they're two totally different origins, two totally different stories. They've just kind of come together, and similar, like, did he pull the sword out of a stone, or did he get the sword given to him by the Lady of the Lake? Like, some versions now will kind of combine the two and have, like, he got it out of a stone, but then it's lost in a lake, or vice versa. They were just two different stories that got combined into one mythological cycle.
Doesn't Beowulf have, like, a lady in a lake with a sword or something like that? Also? Or is that a different thing?
I read the book
I only saw the
25 years ago and saw the movie and mostly was noticing Angelina Jolie.
Fair.
But, like, the main woman in that is the mother of Grendel. Like, Grendel is the first monster, and then his mother, Angelina Jolie, is the second. But yeah, there may well be some origin to that.
It's interesting. I watched most of the first episode of The Last Kingdom, I think on Netflix. It's like Saxon. It's by it's based on a set of novels by Bernard Cornwell, who did the Sharps novels, which I did not read these ones, and I don't think I'm going to keep watching this series, but it's maybe good. I don't know. But it's it's just interesting to see kind of that's the period of, I think it's like the 800s or something. It's the pre Norman invasion.
Right.
And I think I'm wondering whether it kind of goes a little bit into the Arthurian kind of like, the older story, or the Saxon story as opposed to the Norman story.
Right.
Also today or yesterday, I was trying to figure out why they keep saying AL/NL records, like in MLB instead of just saying MLB. And I still don't understand why, but somehow I went down some like Reddit hole and like saw something about how the NFC and the NFL absorbed.
These are all sports ball terms, by the way, for those of us who are totally lost. MLB is Major League Baseball, American League and National League, and NFC is National Football Conference.
That's right. There's an audience for this. I'm not just talking to you. But anyway, like this one large football league absorbed a smaller football league, but took on their 2-point conversion rule. Like, apparently the NFC didn't have the 2-point conversion rule. And so it's like, they absorbed this other, and I mean, I guess these leagues didn't have like huge mythologies built up. Although, you were referencing baseball mythology earlier. So it just kind of, it just felt like a weird parallel of like, two things merging that were similar but different, but how then they end up making something new that has aspects of, both.
Yeah.
It's kind of totally irrelevant, but, hey.
I mean, this whole thing has been, so, Well, I'm glad we could still find an hour of things to discuss in this. I'm not surprised. We could probably go a lot longer. But I'll just say, do you have any last thoughts about the whole, this whole Blart experience and thoughts it leads you to on perspectives and suffering and hope and mythology, or idiots doing podcasts for no good reason or anything else?
I guess at the here on the, kind of at the conclusion of the holiday season, I feel thankful that the people that I like to podcast with and the person I most podcast with did not want me to do that specific thing.
No.
Because I would have said no and probably maybe not felt that bad about it. But, you know, I'm glad that you didn't ask me to watch the movie. This was much better, and I appreciate it. So, yeah.
It's funny because one year they did a thing where one of them didn't watch the movie, and they tried to see if they could guess who hadn't watched it. And
that's interesting.
I do think it would be fun as an idea to have like a once-a-month podcast where 5 people get together to talk about a movie, but every month one person hasn't seen it, and they just try to like guess who that is.
I kind of love that.
That may be a new podcast idea I've come up with right here and now.
No, I love it. I love it. Can I always be the one who didn't watch the movie, though?
This is not in service of laziness.
No, not laziness. I would have to look at the Wikipedia page. I'd have to watch, like, you know, pitch meetings and, like, get all the references and stuff, you know?
Yep. That could be fun. That could be fun. Especially because, I mean, going back, we keep harping on this, but, like, there are definitely mythologies around movies that aren't true.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
I mean...
Play it again, Sam.
Yeah, Luke,
He's literally
I am not your father.
Yeah. It's all there. So, all right, we're going to talk a little bit more about mythology in a bonus section. Till then, though, thank you all so much for listening. This has been a little bit of a strange episode, but strange is what we do here. But the point is we can find something to discuss in anything. Definitely check out the podcast, Till Death Do Us Blart. Do not watch the movie. When Paul was saying they were thankful that I didn't ask them to watch it, I think it's the cinematic equivalent of, oh, this smells so bad. Here, smell this. And I feel like a better person because I've stopped feeling a need to get people to smell this.
Yeah, I think The Flash was the last one that you said anything about smell this.
Yeah, exactly. So check out their podcast. Check out our other podcasts. This Star Wars Universe podcast. Of course, please become a member. $5 a month, $55 a year. Free access to all the bonus content, all the ad-free content, and you're just getting to support us, which is so incredibly helpful. Find all of Paul and my information in the show notes. Until then, not today, Death. Not today.